There is a cruelty that does not require intention. It does not need a raised voice or a clenched fist. It can arrive in a single word, spoken lightly, almost carelessly, as if the speaker does not fully register that the person beside them is a human being with a heart that is listening to every syllable. Patricia Monroe had heard that word exactly once in her marriage. Once, in a moment that her husband believed was private, a comment made on a phone call when he thought she was not in the room. She had heard it, filed it somewhere deep, and spent the 3 years since choosing, daily, deliberately, to believe that it was a moment of weakness rather than a revelation. She had never told anyone. But on the stage of Family Feud, in front of 200 strangers and the most watchful host in daytime television, her husband said it again. Not in private, not on a phone call, out loud, on camera, and Steve Harvey heard every word. What happened in the next 4 minutes is something that neither Patricia Monroe nor anyone who was in that studio will ever forget. Her name was Patricia Monroe. She was 51 years old, a public librarian from Birmingham, Alabama, who had spent the better part of 2 decades building a place where people who had nowhere else to go could always find a chair and a book, and someone who would not ask them to explain themselves. She ran literacy programs for adults who had grown up without access to proper schooling. She organized after-school reading groups for children in underfunded neighborhoods. She remembered the names of every regular patron, the titles they had loved, and the ones they had abandoned halfway through without ever asking for a reason. She was, in the most literal sense of the word, a woman who had devoted her professional life to helping other people find their voices. The particular irony of what was about to happen on that stage was not lost on the people who knew her well. Patricia was what her mother would have called a handsome woman, strong-featured, dark-skinned, with close, cropped natural hair she had worn the same way for 20 years, and a bearing that communicated calm authority without requiring her to say a word. She did not dress for attention. She dressed for function and for the quiet pleasure of looking like herself. She had never been the kind of woman who sought external validation for her appearance, in part because she had been raised not to need it, and in part because she had learned, somewhere in her 40s, that the women who seemed most comfortable in their own skin were the ones who had simply stopped waiting for permission. Her husband was Wendell Monroe. He was 54, a former high school football coach who now worked as a physical education administrator for the city school district. A man whose identity was built substantially around competitiveness, public performance, and the management of other people's perceptions. He was loud in the way that coaches are loud, projecting confidence as a professional reflex, filling whatever room he occupied with the particular energy of someone accustomed to being the most certain person in it. He was not a malicious man. He was not, at his core, cruel. He was something arguably more damaging. He was careless. He had spent 54 years moving through the world at full volume without developing much sensitivity to the specific frequencies on which the people closest to him were hearing him. They had been married for 19 years. They had one son, Marcus, 24, who was working as a physical therapist in Mobile. He had not been able to join the Family Feud taping due to a scheduling conflict, which meant the family team was rounded out by Patricia's sister Denise and her teenage niece Jalen, who had submitted the application as a birthday surprise for Patricia's 51st birthday. Jalen was 17 years old and had written in the application that her Aunt Patricia was the person she most wanted to be when she grew up. The producers had called the next afternoon. 3 years before the taping, Patricia had been standing in the kitchen when she heard Wendell on a phone call in the hallway. She had not been eavesdropping. She had simply been standing there, and the house was quiet, and the word had carried clearly. He had been talking to someone she did not know, a friend, she assumed, or a colleague. And he had been describing her, and the word he had used was the word that a husband should never, in any context, for any reason, apply to the woman he chose. She had stood very still in that kitchen. She had finished what she was doing. She had said nothing. She had told herself, for 3 years, that it was one moment, that it did not define what he felt about her, that the accumulated evidence of 19 years of marriage was more reliable than a single overheard sentence. She was still in the process of convincing herself of that when they walked onto the Family Feud stage. The Monroe family came to the stage with the energy of a group that had been looking forward to this for weeks. Wendell in particular arrived with the full force of his personality deployed, handshaking, joke-making, warming the room with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades managing gym floors and pep rallies and parent meetings. He was immediately and genuinely likable. The audience responded to him the way audiences respond to men who perform confidence well with laughter and warmth and a certain willingness to be led. Patricia was quieter beside him, not subdued. She was present and engaged and smiled genuinely at the warm-up exchanges, but operating at a different register than her husband, the way people sometimes do when one person in a partnership has claimed all the available space and the other has simply learned to work within what remains. Denise, Patricia's sister, was funny and sharp and clearly devoted to Patricia in the way that sisters are devoted when they have watched someone absorb more than they should have for longer than anyone realized. She stood close to Patricia throughout. Jalen, 17 and thrilled to be on television, bounced on her heels during every correct answer. The Monroes played well. Wendell buzzed in aggressively and scored on several questions. Patricia's answers were considered and often the ones that pushed the family ahead. They had the comfortable coordination of a family that knew each other deeply, even when the dynamics within that familiarity were complicated. It was during the bonus round, while Steve Harvey was working through his between-answer banter with the family, that the question landed. Steve had been in a back and forth with Wendell about the family dynamic. Who ran things at home? Who had the final say? The comfortable territory of marriage-based humor that both contestants and audiences navigate easily. Wendell had been performing the role of the slightly hen-pecked but cheerful husband, which was getting laughs, and the room was warm and loose. Then Steve turned to the audience the way he sometimes does to build a moment, and said, "All right, I have to ask the real question, Wendell, and I want you to think carefully before you answer this. What is it about Patricia that made you know she was the one?" It was a softball, an open door, the kind of question that invites a man to say something generous about his wife on national television, and that nearly every husband answers with some version of warmth. Wendell laughed. He looked at Patricia. He looked back at Steve, and in the way that some people respond to open doors by walking confidently through them without looking where they are going, he said, "Well, it wasn't her looks." He laughed again. He was still laughing when the room did not laugh with him. The silence that followed was not the brief, awkward silence of a joke that missed. It was a longer, more serious silence. The silence of 200 people simultaneously registering that something had just been said that could not be unsaid. Patricia's expression did not change. That was the part that broke the room. The fact that she did not look shocked or hurt or visibly wounded, but simply still, in the way of a person who has already heard this particular thing once and whose body has learned to receive it without registering the impact from the outside. Denise's face told a different story entirely. She had gone rigid. Her eyes moved to her sister immediately, and what was in them was not surprise but recognition. The recognition of someone finally hearing out loud the thing they had suspected was happening in private. Jalen, 17 years old and operating on the instinct of someone who loved her aunt purely and uncomplicated, said quietly from the back of the family group, "That's not funny, Uncle Wendell." Wendell was still processing the silence of the room. The smile had not fully left his face yet, but it was fading fast. Steve Harvey had not moved. He was looking at Wendell Monroe with an expression that had none of the performance of the previous several minutes, none of the warmth for the cameras, none of the host energy. He was looking at him the way a man looks at another man when something has been said that requires a response. "Come here," Steve said. It was 2 words, said quietly, without hostility, and they were somehow more arresting than anything louder could have been. Steve Harvey stepped away from the center mark on the stage floor and walked to where Wendell Monroe was standing. He did not do it quickly. He did it deliberately, The way you approach a conversation you want to have properly rather than efficiently. He stopped about 2 feet from Wendell and looked at him without speaking for just long enough that the room understood the full weight of what was coming. "I need to ask you something," Steve said. His voice was level and without performance. "And I need you to hear me before you answer." He paused. "How long have you been married to this woman?" 19 years, Wendell said. His earlier ease had gone entirely. 19 years. Steve repeated. "And in 19 years, did that woman ever embarrass you? Did she ever belittle you? Did she ever say something about you in public that made you feel small?" Wendell said nothing. "Because what you just did," Steve said, still in that same even tone, "is you stood on national television, in front of your wife, in front of your family, in front of 200 people and a camera, and you told the world that your wife is not attractive. That is what you said. That is what every person in this room heard." He let that sit for a moment. "I don't think you understood what you were saying when you said it, but I need you to understand it now." Wendell's jaw had tightened. He was a man who was not accustomed to being corrected in public, and the effort of receiving the correction with grace rather than defensiveness was visible on his face. "I was joking," he said. "I know you were joking," Steve said. "That's what worries me." He turned slightly, not to the audience, but to where Patricia was standing. "Because your wife didn't look surprised. Did you notice that? She didn't flinch. She didn't react. And you know why she didn't react?" Wendell was silent. "Because she has heard something like that before," Steve said. "I don't know where, I don't know when, but a woman doesn't stand that still unless she already knows how to stand that still." Across the stage, Patricia's eyes had filled, not with tears that fell, but with the particular brightness of someone whose private experience has just been named accurately by someone who had no way of knowing it. Denise reached over and took her sister's hand. Steve turned back to Wendell. "I am going to tell you something that I want you to keep for the rest of your marriage," he said. "Your wife gets up every morning and goes to work in a library in Birmingham, Alabama, helping people find their voices. She runs programs for adults who never learned to read. She shows up for strangers. She is, by every account I can tell from standing here for 20 minutes, an exceptional human being." He paused. "And she chose you. Out of everyone she could have chosen, she chose you. For 19 years. His voice had not risen once during any of this. It was the steadiness of it that made it land so completely. "The correct answer to my question, the one and only correct answer, is that you are the lucky one. And you need to spend every remaining day of this marriage making sure she knows you understand that." The audience responded with a wave of applause that built slowly rather than erupting. The kind of applause that comes from people who have been moved rather than entertained. Wendell Monroe stood in it. He did not deflect, did not look at the crowd for support, did not reach for another joke. He looked at his wife. "You're right," he said to Steve, but he was looking at Patricia. "She deserved a better answer than that. She deserves a better answer than that every single day, and He stopped. Started again. "I have never once stood up in front of people and said what I actually think about this woman, who she actually is, what she actually means to me." He shook his head slowly. "That ends today." He walked across the stage to Patricia. He stood in front of her. He did not try to manage how this looked or perform it for the cameras. He simply said, "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known. You are kind in a way I do not have the range to match. You have given me 19 years of your life, and you have done it with more grace than I deserved. And you are, Patricia, you are beautiful. You are beautiful, and I should have been saying that every day, and I am sorry that I have not." Patricia looked at her husband for a long moment. Then she said, with the quiet precision of a librarian who had chosen words carefully for 30 years, "That is the most honest thing you have said to me in a very long time." It was not a romantic ending. It was something better than that. It was a true one. Steve Harvey faced the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you just saw is a man figuring out, in real time, that the most important audience he will ever perform for is standing right next to him." He paused. "Take notes." The Monroe family completed the game. Patricia played the fast money round with a focus that the studio staff would later describe as remarkable. Not rigid, not suppressed, but the genuine concentration of a woman who had just been given something she did not know she was still waiting for and who was now, steadily and without drama, getting on with the afternoon. The family won enough points for a prize, and when the total was announced, Wendell turned to Patricia before he turned to anyone else. It was a small thing. Nobody on the production team called it out, but Denise noticed, Jalen noticed, and Patricia noticed, which was the only audience that mattered. When the episode aired, the segment moved through the internet in the way that things move when they capture something people recognize from their own lives. The specific quality that made it spread was not the dramatic revelation. It was not a secret family or a years-long betrayal, but something more ordinary and therefore more widely resonant. The moment of Steve Harvey standing 2 feet from a man and asking him, quietly and without aggression, whether he understood what his carelessness had been costing his wife. That question reached people, not just women who had heard similar words in similar silences, but men who recognized, with varying degrees of discomfort, the version of Wendell Monroe that lives in the habit of assuming that the people you love most can always absorb whatever you say without keeping score. The comment sections beneath the clip were unusual in their composition. There were the expected responses, women sharing their own experiences, expressions of solidarity, the natural community that forms around a recognized experience. But there were also a significant number of messages from men who wrote, with what appeared to be genuine reflection, about the casual ways they had diminished their own partners without registering the cumulative weight of it. One comment was quoted and reshared more than any other. It was from a man who wrote simply, "I watched this and then I went and apologized to my wife for something I said 14 years ago that I had convinced myself she had forgotten." She had not forgotten. Patricia was interviewed once, briefly, about the episode. She was characteristically precise. "The word Wendell used was not the word that mattered most to me," she said. "What mattered was that I had been standing next to that word for 3 years, not saying anything, because I had told myself it did not represent how he really felt." What Steve Harvey did, without knowing any of that history, was create a situation where Wendell had to say how he really felt. Out loud, in front of people. She paused. "I had been waiting 3 years for that. I just did not know how to ask for it." She returned to the Birmingham Public Library the following Monday. Her regular patrons noticed nothing different about her. She was the same person she had always been, steady, present, the woman who remembered everyone's name and nobody's excuse. But she had placed, on the small shelf behind her desk, a single photograph she had not had there before. A photo taken by Jalen on her phone in the green room after the taping, in which Patricia and Wendell were sitting next to each other, not posing, just sitting, and both of them were laughing. It was the kind of photograph that takes itself, the kind that you only get in the moments between the moments, when nobody is performing anything. Steve Harvey spoke about Patricia Monroe during an event several months after the broadcast, and his words were brief and without embellishment. "There are women who walk through this world doing extraordinary things quietly and without asking for recognition," he said. "They show up for strangers the way most people only show up for family. They hold communities together. They teach people to read. They build libraries in their own living rooms out of patience and care and years of showing up." He paused. "And then they go home, and sometimes, at home, the people who are supposed to see them most clearly see them least." He let that sit. "Part of my job, the part of my job I care most about, is making sure that when those women come to stand on my stage, they leave that stage knowing that they were seen, fully, accurately, without apology." Wendell Monroe did not speak publicly about the episode. He continued his work in school administration, and those who knew the family noted, over the months that followed, that he had become somewhat quieter in social settings, less likely to fill silence with performance, more likely to let his wife be the one who spoke. It was a small change. It was the right change. Their son Marcus called from Mobile the evening the episode aired. He spoke to his mother for a long time and his father for a shorter time. When he spoke to his father, he said one thing, "Do better, Dad." Wendell told him he was right. Then he went and told Patricia that their son had called, and he told her what Marcus had said, without omitting the part that was difficult, because he understood by then that the space between them had been built in part out of exactly those kinds of omissions, and that it was past time to stop building it. Jalen, who had submitted the birthday application that started everything, turned 18 that same year and applied to college with a personal essay about her Aunt Patricia. She described a woman who had spent her career teaching other people the value of their own voices, and who had spent an afternoon on a game show being reminded of the value of her own. She described what it meant to watch your hero be publicly honored after years of quiet service. She was accepted to 3 universities. She chose the one with the strongest library science program. She wanted, she said, to do what her aunt did, to build a place where people who had nowhere else to go could always find a chair and someone who would not ask them to explain themselves. There is no cleaner legacy than that. If this story stayed with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring you the moments that go beyond the game. The moments when real people, under real lights, choose honesty over comfort and remind all of us what it looks like to truly see one another. Share this with someone who deserves to be told today that they are seen.